Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at our beautiful Aspen Meadows campus this evening for our McCloskey Speaker Series. I'm Dan Porterfield, the President and CEO of the Aspen Institute. First, a few words of thanks. The biggest to Tom and Bonnie McCloskey. Thank you so much, Tom and Bonnie, for supporting this lecture series, for all you represent. Also, a big thanks to our Aspen Institute staff, especially my colleague Crystal Logan, who's here today, and the Aspen Community Programs team for organizing this event, but also, and most importantly, for taking every safety precaution, everything from the app to the way we organize the seating, to using our tents, to making sure that we were consulting with public health experts each time we convene. A big thanks to the Aspen group for making sure we can convene in a way that's engaging and safe. Thank you all. And then, of course, thank you to each and every one of you for coming together. It is just an incredible feeling still to look out at a crowd of people gathered together in person, able to respond to in-person experts, to be able to share ideas with one another, to have a drink at a reception, or to be able to go for a walk together. And each one of you went to some inconvenience to fill out our safety app to make sure that we have a group that has either received a test today or was vaccinated. I realize it may have been inconvenient to get registered on the app, but thank you so much. It's almost morally uplifting to be able to be together in person, to exchange ideas, and to hear from two great speakers like those who made the effort to travel to join us today. And so let me now introduce our conversation. We're joined this evening by former U.S. Congressman from the 23rd District of Texas, Will Hurd, who will be in conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times, David Sanger. Congressman Hurd served his district from 2015 until this year. He is currently a managing director at Allen & Company and is a former cybersecurity executive and former undercover officer in the CIA. How do we know you're not undercover now?
No comment.
No.
I just assume you are.
For almost 2 decades, he's been involved in the most pressing national security issues challenging our country, and has been involved in many different Aspen Institute programs to take a look at national security, homeland security issues, and help think in the most comprehensive and inclusive way possible about how we respond to the challenges of our time. David Sanger is a White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. In a 38-year reporting career, he has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. His newest book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, is not only a bestseller, but also an HBO documentary by the same title, examined the emergence of cyber conflict and its role in the changing nature of global power. Enormous topic. He served as Tokyo bureau chief, Washington economic correspondent, White House correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and chief Washington correspondent, and like Will, very active with the Aspen Institute, a great friend of ours. Please join me in welcoming Will and David to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to my friend Will. It's great to be here. Will and I have been on a lot of Zoom meetings together because we're on the Aspen Cyber Group together, but I don't think we actually seen each other in a year and a half.
It's been a while. So.
That's right. And it wasn't simply because he left Congress. But now that we've mentioned that you left Congress, let's start by talking a little bit about Congress and all that. Oh, and what we're envisioning tonight, folks, is that we're going to talk for 40, 45 minutes about the state of the Republican Party. Will was in State of Congress today. We want to talk a little bit about the nation's agenda, how the new administration is doing. And then since Will and I have such a particular affinity in the cyber arena, we wanted to talk a little bit about that, because it really is the central way that nations compete and undercut each other these days, and in very different ways. Will and I have spent a huge amount of time on that. And if you go and watch that HBO documentary that Dan mentioned, you will see Will in it as one of the stars. So, Will, let me start by asking what you think is happening in the Republican Party today. As we were saying beforehand, before we came out here, if I was to have guessed on January 6th where the party was going to go and how it would react to those events, I would have thought that after President Trump left office, the party would have regrouped and kind of forgotten about him. And you made the good point that that's kind of what the Democrats did with Jimmy Carter after his loss. It's only in recent years and in recent weeks that Jimmy Carter's sort of come back with kind of a fond set of memories. That's not what happened. Mm-hmm. They ended up coalescing around the former president. So dissect for us what's happening.
Sure. I'll obviously focus on the GOP because that's my party, but we're seeing similar trends in both parties, and ultimately, part of my concern is that the fringes, the political continuum is no longer a line; it's a horseshoe. And the fringes are closer to each other than they are to the middle. And both parties are appealing to the edges rather than that center. And so ultimately, that's why you're seeing the fact that a number of Republican primary voters, a large group, depending on what polling you look at, still believe Donald Trump should be the titular head of the Republican Party. They would vote for him again if he was running for an election. And so many
of them believe he should be the legitimately elected president.
Sure. And so that is the primary voter. That is what Republicans are dealing with in the Republican electorate. The broader concern here, and why that is catching on, and you're seeing what I consider to be a lack of ideological consistency within the party, within both parties, to be frank, is in 2020, 92% of the House seats were decided in the primary. Only 34 seats were split tickets, right? So in the previous presidential election, people voted for one party of president and the opposite party for the House seat. 34. That's 8%. That's insane. That number 20 years ago was north of 75. 30 years ago, that number was in the 90s, and 40 years ago, it was well over 125, right? And so the fact that most of these decisions are being made in a primary. Then you look at, again, these are 2020 numbers, the average number of people that voted in a contested primary, whether it was Republican or Democrat, the average, 55,000 people. That means 27,501 people decided who 92% went to Washington, D.C. Now, in my election, it's really one of the jump balls, it can go either way. 325,000 people come out to vote, right? And so the fact that you don't have enough people voting in these primaries, yes, there's a number of initiatives to try to make it, to expand or to change how the primary process works, but ultimately, we need more people voting in those primaries. And so, when you look at those 55,000 people in a primary, and 30% of them, 30 to 40% of them, are believing that, not believing something around Donald Trump should be the future of the Republican Party, that's where the problem is. And I would pretend Donald Trump lost, right? Like he lost kind of by a big number when it was all kind of all said. And then when you look at other Republicans, the two takeaways in 2020, in my opinion, don't be a jerk, don't be a socialist. That was the takeaway. And unfortunately, both sides one side's trying to become bigger jerks, the other side's trying to become bigger socialists, and they didn't take their lesson away from that election. Republicans significantly, down ballot, significantly outperformed Donald Trump in the 2020 election. And why some of those folks are still subscribing to that, I don't know the answer.
So within Texas, state you grew up in, know well, live in now. We've seen the state legislature go the route that many of the state legislatures have in recent times with the voting laws. And that, if it passes, if they can ever round up the Democrats who are living up in D.C. now, if in the end that passes, is that going to only accentuate the trends that you just described?
I don't think so. And let me start with this. We should be increasing access to voting, right? Period, full stop. We should be making it easier to vote. We should be encouraging folks to vote. Period. We should also know who is coming into the ballot booth and pulling the lever or filling out the form. And ultimately, 2020 was one of the most secure elections in the history of the United States. Right? This notion that there needed to be integrity because there was some funny business. Well, in my state, in 2020, a lot of folks thought that the Democrats were going to take over the State House, and this would have been the first time in a couple of decades. People thought that we were going to see more losses by Republicans in Congress. That didn't happen. And so if this was an insecure election, and that was bad for us, we won, guys, right? So let's focus on this. However, this current bill in Texas, right, the hyperbole that is being used by both sides around this issue is obscuring the fact. The Dallas Morning News, the editorial board, wrote an excellent piece this week, kind of breaking down. People were saying that you won't be able to take an Uber to go vote. That's not true. Some of the things that were included in the legislation 6 months ago are not included this. Republicans took on some of the changes, the preventing voting on Sunday, that's no longer in there. And so the hyperbole is getting a little out of control, and this is one of the problems that Democrats are facing in Texas. When you have some of these more extreme positions, and again, my belief is increase access to voting. How can we make it easier? How can we do online voting? Hell, if Estonia can do it, right now, Estonia only has 1.4 million people, the size of San Antonio. However, they have a neighbor called Russia, right, that's trying to always hack everything that they're doing. You know, one of the first major attacks we saw on a country, and only elements of the country, was in Estonia in 2007. So these are where the kind of conversation should be, and how do we encourage more folks to vote is where this should be. Oh, and by the way, if your view as a party that is not encouraging vote and believe that less people vote is better because you can win, that's a bad place to be. You may need to rethink your ideas if you're not interested in appealing to more folks. And what I learned in my time, nobody thought a black Republican could win in a 71% Latino district. Right? That was when I first got elected. Everybody, all the reporters asked me that question. And it's called show up, engage people, talk about the things that they care about. Right? People, care about food on their table, a roof over their head, and the people they love being healthy and happy. Talk about those things. Republicans should be talking about education. And we have income inequality because we have education inequality. And so what are the things that we can be doing to increase, kids being able to move up that economic ladder? We have some great successes that we can point to from conservative policy, and we're getting away from that. And that's a winning issue.
Well, it's interesting because you say it's a winning issue, and I believe you, but that party isn't acting like it's a winning issue because I could have, even in the Romney-Obama time, told you what the Republican Party stood for. Free trade issues, spreading democracy. George W. Bush, in his second inaugural address, devoted the entire thing to making it the mission of the United States to spread democracy around the world. He had just, of course, been through the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions. You might say that that was an overly big or not big enough mission, but he was trying to define the Republican Party around that. We're not hearing any of that now.
Sure.
We are hearing an adherence to a person in Trump or away from Trump, but the set of ideas that define the party seems to have leached away. Is that going to come back? Is this just a temporary, do we have to go through 1 or 2 cycles to get to that? What do you think?
So I think that's the actual opportunity, right? And you know, in when you're selling a widget, right, you think about your current customers, but you're also thinking about the people that aren't buying your product, and you want to figure out how you get more people to buy it, right? I once was on a panel with a bunch of YouTube stars. I am not a YouTube star. Let me put that. I don't know why I was on the panel. The combined group probably had a billion fans on their YouTube channels, and one of the people was The Rock's digital person, Dwayne Johnson, and this was when the movie Moana came out, and the woman says, if Moana fails at the box office, are we going to blame the moviegoers for not going to the movie, or are you going to say it was a crummy movie? Now, I've seen Moana, it's a great movie, I'm not saying it's a crummy movie, and it did well at the box office, but she went on to add that in politics is the only place where you say, you know, shame on the voters for not coming out. It's because people are not providing them something that they want to come out for, right? And I think the opportunity to explain what we are for, not what we're against, is the real opportunity in the Republican Party. Now, there's not too many people that are talking about that,
Yeah.
you know, but I think that's where the opportunity is. And what is that? We've oftentimes, not just Republicans, when I say we, I'm talking about Americans, we have taken things for granted, like democracy, right? We just celebrated 245 years. It's called an experiment, because it didn't exist when we started it. Nobody thought it was going to work. It was not a fait accompli. It was 60 more years later that the next democratic government happened, and that was Switzerland. There's only 14 countries that have been a democracy for more than 100 years, right? It wasn't until 2001 that the number of democracies equaled authoritarian topics. Why do these things matter is what more people do. And guess what? If a Republican does that, guess what? We're going to win. What happened in the 2020 elections, this notion of defunding the police and abolishing the police and getting rid of Border Patrol and getting rid of ICE, you know, those things did not resonate with those people in those communities, to include Democrats, because border security is an actual public safety issue to people along the border, right? And so we can be humane to the people that are in our control, right? But we can also take care of our borders as well, right? So anyways, like, I got a little worked up, I apologize, but that's the opportunity. Instead of trying to retread old things, right? Or just to appeal to someone based on a personality.
So what's fascinating to me about the list that you just laid out is that if Joe Biden or Tony Blinken were on this stage, and at various moments they have been, they'd probably endorse 99% of what it was that you just said. One of the most surprising things to me about Biden, as he has, we're now nearly at 6 months, we will be in just a few days, is that he has defined the struggle of our time right now as autocracy versus democracy. He has tried a series of steps that I think, some of which will work, some of which I suspect are going to fail, to try to organize the Western allies in a much harder line against China than we actually heard during the Trump years, and certainly than we heard during the Obama years. So walk us through a little bit about how you assess what he's done and what's been surprising about this for you. Sure. It seems to me that he's adopted some of what you just described.
Look, David, what I just said, this is what I've learned representing a congressional district that flipped back and forth, Republican, Democrat, and crisscrossing the country. Way more unites us than divides us. right? And unfortunately, we want to focus on those things that divide us rather than those things that unite us. And so the things I just outlined, you know, when I was out knocking on doors, telling people, hey, I want to be your member of Congress, and I talked about those things, they're like, oh, no one's ever come to my door, and no one's ever talked about that. So, you know, explain the why. What has President Biden gotten wrong? He's gotten the border wrong, right? Plain and simple. This is indeed a crisis. The numbers, the first 8 months of this fiscal year, I think the number is 927,000, let's call it 930, 930,000 apprehensions at the border. The last two times we've called this the situation a crisis, 2019 and 2014. That is a 40% increase and a 135% increase, right? It is a real problem. And these communities, most people don't realize this, that these communities along the border, 50% of their operating budget for their community comes from the ad valorem taxes of legal immigration, which has been stopped for a year and a half. And so now these communities are having to deal with this crisis. And we're treating everybody that's coming in between the ports of entry is illegal, right? You can't do that in any country. And so we treat everybody, even the ones that are coming here illegal, as if they're an asylum seeker. When you do that, the people that truly need asylum are losing out. And when you look historically, when you finally go through an immigration court and apply for asylum, it takes like a year and a half. There's well over 1 million backlog of these cases. That's insane. We should be able to adjudicate a case in 9 months. And only 30% of the people are actually getting granted asylum. So border security, and guess what? We know the kingpin human smugglers, the human traffickers, the drug trafficking organizations, you know, these are folks that are having to replicate their behavior multiple times. And they're taking advantage of folks that are trying to flee a bad situation. Oh, and by the way, let's address root causes in some of these places, right? Historically, it's been the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Right now, what we're seeing fuel this current crisis is single men from Mexico. A part of that is the economic situation that we're seeing in Mexico. So President Biden's gotten the border wrong.
And what would you tell him right now that he needs to do to straighten that out?
So he started right in the wrong. I've been advocating for 6 years to have a special coordinator for the Northern Triangle, a diplomat that is focusing on coordinating all of our efforts in that region. He did that a couple of months ago, so that was a right step. You also need a lot of people throw around the Marshall Plan. You know, we need a Marshall Plan for this, Marshall Plan for that. We really need a Marshall Plan for the Northern Triangle, a 10-year plan that has all of the economic entities in concert with each other and working with the philanthropic organizations that are providing aid into those places. It needs to be based on a needs assessment from those 3 countries. We're going to have to include Mexico into that. And so a multilateral deal over probably a decade is what is going to be needed. Oh, and by the way, this can be a framework on how we counter the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government, right? The Secretary of Defense has to come in front of Congress and do a national defense strategy. The National Security Advisor or the DNI comes in and presents a national security strategy. Nobody presents a national economic strategy. And we can start with focusing on the Northern Triangle. You do this, stop treating everybody as an asylum seeker with the next thing. Oh, and by the way, put more money in the budget for technology in order to understand what's going back and forth across our border. Those are some of the first steps that I would advocate for the administration. When it comes to dealing with some of the cyber threats that we're seeing, one of my early criticisms of the Obama administration is that they didn't do public attribution, name and shame, right? Yep. Sometimes attribution, you know it's coming, that could be used as a...
We ended up having to be the ones
for sure.
who did it out of leaked reports from your old colleagues, yeah.
For sure. I think President Biden has done has taken that even further than what President Trump had done, and so I think that is an area that trying to get Congress coalesced in order to provide the resources we need in order to defend our digital infrastructure. The going on the offense, taking the Bitcoin back in the hack, the Colonial Pipeline hack. That was a pretty significant move. Our friend Lisa Monaco at DOJ is being aggressive in making sure we're perpetuating. One thing I would do, and I'm sure they've thought through this, is reestablishing someone at the State Department that focuses on multilateral organizations around cybersecurity, because I believe, and I know we've talked a lot about deterrence and whether it's worked or not, you have to have laws in every country that says these kinds of hacks are against the law, and that host country will cooperate with the international community to bring those people to justice. And so I could even advocate that if you don't have that law and a hack from your country impacts us, then you're culpable for that attack. Does that escalate this issue of deterrence? I don't know, but those are the kind of thinking that we need to be.
So the last one that you just described is a pretty close-in description of what it is that President Biden said to Putin. I was on the trip to Europe and Geneva, and
I hope you left your phone at home.
It's interesting. As we got off Air Force One in Geneva, the Secret Service said, leave your phones here, because Geneva is one of the most revved up by the Russians cities. The government officials all did. Of course, the journalists, their phone is actually bonded to their hands, so we did not.
Don't call me on that number.
That's it. Remember when I tried you earlier today?
Yeah, exactly.
Too late, man. So that was the essence of what Biden later told us that he had said to Putin. And I actually asked him at one point, this was an hour or two after the Putin meeting, did you specifically say that you would go back after them in a cyber way if an attack is launched from their territory, even if it's a ransomware attack that may not be a government-sponsored one? And he maintained, yes, that's what he did. And then, of course, he called Putin a week ago today about the most recent ransomware attacks, and then you saw Reveal, this Russian language group, fall offline on Tuesday. I think that was probably the Russians taking them down. I don't think it was the U.S. yet. So you could argue he's moving in that direction, but I'm not certain that the rest of the world is ready to go sign up to something in which they're responsible for every attack that launches from their territory, even if a government didn't do it.
Look, it's hard. This is hard, and this is why you have to have allies to come up with a framework on how we're going to address these issues. It's the age-old question: what is a digital act of war? Right? And we know if Kim Jong-un launched a missile into San Francisco, we know how we would respond. They know how we would respond. That's part of deterrence. But when there's no loss of life from a cyber attack, when it was espionage, when it was theft of information, what is the appropriate digital response? Is it stealing their stuff? No. We should be having a robust intelligence collection around the world that helps keep America safe. But do you break their systems, right? Like, what is the appropriate response? And this is where, depending on where the attack comes from, it matters. What can we be doing? We can be improving our own digital defenses. And one of the things that's so frustrating to me, SolarWinds is let's put an asterisk on that, because it's super sophisticated. Finding out that a zero-day exploit was used. Zero-day is a vulnerability in software that was previously unknown. But the majority of the hacks we've all heard about include things that we know about. right? And so GAO, in one of my favorite entities and one of my favorite agencies in the federal government. You know, I don't think anybody's ever said that but me. But they've categorized and cataloged all this, that you're not doing some of the very basics in digital hygiene, right? Guess what? We take a shower every day. We comb our hair. We brush our teeth, right? We wash our clothes. If we don't, what happens? You get funky, right? And so same comes with digital hygiene. And so we need to be making sure that we're not just the federal government, but the private sector is doing the basics when it comes to digital hygiene. And so OMB has a role in this to make sure that the CIOs, the chief information officers, have all the tools that they can in order to defend those digital systems.
Well, you've seen Biden take one big step in this direction, which was the requirement that if you're going to sell to the federal government, you have to meet these standards.
Sure.
And once you do that, of course, if a company got the reputation that they couldn't sell to the federal government anymore, nobody else is going to buy from them either. So the idea is that this spreads. But I wanted to pick up on one thing that you alluded to because it goes back to your intelligence background. Part of the hesitance you see of the United States in setting these kinds of standards and pushing for them globally is there things we do that we don't want to give up doing. Mm-hmm. So obviously all countries spy on each other, and you don't see President Biden or others getting terribly upset about operations that were purely about information gathering. But we are worried about when there's data manipulation. We're worried about when there is actual destruction of facilities. We're worried when the Colonial Pipeline shuts down or JBS, a big meat manufacturer, is hit by a ransomware attack and they have to shut down. The problem is we have, after our rafts of lawyers gone through it, done destructive cyber acts. If you believe what I've been writing for the past 10 years, we and the Israelis took down the Iranian centrifuge program to slow their nuclear program. And so if we start arguing for cases in which the world agrees you're not going to do destructive hacks, your old bosses are going to stand up in the Situation Room and say, let's not set a rule we can't live with. How do we get around that?
Look, I think, one, can we get all of our allies to agree on something like that, right? I don't know the answer. I think there are, the notion that the United States of America would ever take a grid offline of another country for something other than a response to, in an actual war, right, is different than the worst scenario I can think of. Like, the Russians have the capabilities. They have a willingness to use this because guess what? They're disconnected from so many people in the economy that they think the benefit outweighs the risk, right? The Chinese government is different. Our economy, I always say we're frenemies, right? Our economies are interconnected in a way that us and Russia or the Soviet Union ever were, but they probably have better capabilities than the Russians. And we know that our food, water, power can be impacted. Let's throw in our financial markets. And I'm not worried about the Chinese doing that before invading us. I'm worried about the Chinese doing that before they do something in Taiwan in order to tie us up. And that we are going to allow what happened in Hong Kong ultimately happen in Taiwan. Why is Taiwan different? And we can talk about this for another 45 minutes, is that 100% of semiconductors are done in China and Taiwan. And if you think it's hard, I tried to upgrade my phone recently, 6 weeks to be able to get a new phone. Right? Imagine if we had no control over that pipeline. And we know the Chinese government is trying to surpass the United States of America as a global superpower in many of these advanced technologies. And all this debate, right, on cyber, how do you defend, what's a digital act of war, is going to look like a pillow fight once somebody achieves quantum supremacy. Right? And not enough people are talking about quantum computing. The thing I've learned about being connected to the national security apparatus for 21 years is that assessments everybody says it's going to take this amount of time for someone to do this. Divide that by half, at least, right? And why does quantum supremacy matter? Our adversaries are going to be able to decrypt everything that's encrypted right now. They're already sucking up all the ciphertext, right? So you have an exchange, you have some digital data, it gets encrypted, that comes in the ciphertext, that ciphertext moves from point A to point B, you can grab that stuff. And usually you don't grab it because it's gibberish, right? But quantum computing is going to allow us to do that.
To do faster. It'll also allow us to encrypt things better if we've got...
For sure.
Right.
So we need to start having the conversation about post-RSA encryption in order to defend ourselves from that period when the Chinese government is going to be able to have quantum computing, because then we are really laid bare and it will no longer have to be an actual hack. They'll just have that information.
So in our last few minutes before we go to questions, let's connect the first part of our conversation with this part. Mm-hmm. If you go back and you watch the Nixon-Kennedy debates and you're not busy looking for the question of whether Nixon really lost and the sweat and all that, and you just listen to the content, it was an extremely detailed discussion of our capabilities versus the Russian capabilities. You listen to it and you say, we have no debate now that is at that level. We've somehow dumbed down our discussions when we get to presidential debates. If we were to have the equivalent of that today, it wouldn't be over missile capability, it would be over cyber capability. It would be, are we investing enough in quantum? It would be, are we encrypting enough? If we encrypt enough, what do we do about our law enforcement agencies that complain we're encrypting too much and they can't solve kidnapping crimes or drug crimes? Whether or not we are investing enough in semiconductors. You've seen Biden propose a huge plan. It got through the Senate recently. It's still not through the House, interestingly. But that's involving moving some of Taiwan Semiconductor's capability here to the U.S. Could we move to a political world again where those are debated the way the Nixon-Kennedy debates did this with nuclear? Or is it simply too complex? Are you going to lose too much of the American public? Are people going to say, my life does not have to do with encryption. Sure. It has to do with getting food on the table?
Can we? Yes, right? I was the IT procurement guy in Congress, right? Nobody's ever held a parade for IT procurement. But when you go back and you tell people that are working hard and that the federal government spends $80 billion a year on digital goods and services and 80% of that is on old, outdated stuff, they get super outraged, right? You got to explain why it matters. And I believe that the public wants to have that. But it also requires all of us to model the behavior we want to see. How many here have clicked on an article that said Congress worked? This is a very sophisticated audience.
Has such an article been written?
Look, that's my point. My friend Greg told me this week, recently, that the Senate passed a piece of legislation on a climate change legislation dealing in agriculture 89-9.
Yeah.
92-8, even better, right? Did anybody? I didn't even know about it, right? And I follow this stuff. And so there are some of these examples that exist out there, but we click on things that create conflict and that create drama. We like that, right? And so if we need to model the behavior that we want to see, has anybody, depending on what your political philosophy is, if you want to see more cooperation in Congress or in just local government and state government, if you are a Democrat, have you ever said something nice about a Republican legislator that did something right, and vice versa if you're a Republican? So part of that is let's model the behavior that we want to see, but I also believe that, again, this is an opportunity for someone to come along and talk about those issues, talk about things that we care about, because I want to make sure that America continues to uplift humanity for another 245 years. And in order to do that, we have to start talking about these serious issues, because our economic and military dominance is no longer guaranteed in this world. And what does that mean? That means our 401ks are not going to get as much money. Our kids are not going to be able to have as good a paying jobs. Our ability to, what we can purchase with our money is going to shrink. That's the ramifications of allowing some of these political fights to get in the way of having real debates on what percentage of GDP should be spent on healthcare. How do we, continue to increase educational opportunities for everyone? How do we take care of our seniors that are having difficulty? Like, those are where the conversation should be. That's my experience. When I'm out there on the stump. I don't get asked those questions necessarily when I'm on, whether it's Fox News, MSNBC, or CNN, but I feel like America wants that.
Well, that would be a great segue to go to all of your questions. So we've got microphones on both sides, so we'll start with you, and microphones coming right down to you here. And please make the questions, since we only have 15 minutes or so, brief and to the point.
Why did you leave Congress? And number two, you were in the Problem Solvers Caucus, and therefore you're very familiar with the problem of the two leaders of the Senate and the House, who are the four corners who run things. And what do you think the future is for NoLabels.org and the Problem Solvers Caucus?
Sure. Problem Solvers is a group of Republicans and Democrats. It's balanced. That most come from difficult districts, right? And we would meet. It was one of the only times you had during the congressional week, Republicans and Democrat meeting, talking about the issues of the day or whatever the legislative agenda was. Not to get too wonky on the problems of where Congress is, but 20 years ago, the chairperson of appropriations wrote the bill that funded the government. It wasn't the speaker. It wasn't the majority leader. It was the chair and that ranking member working with the Republicans and Democrats on that committee in order to get those things done. And so an appropriation chairperson could tell the speaker to stick it where the sun don't shine, right? And that doesn't exist now. Everything is concentrated within leadership, and whether that's Republicans or Democrat, that is part of the problem of why you see this uber partisanship happening in Congress, and we've been moving in that direction for the last 20 years. Will somebody give up that power and devolve and push that back to the committees to solve these problems? It's going to require a speaker that understands and appreciates the role that Congress plays. We haven't seen that in a while. Why did I leave? These jobs aren't designed to be in forever. I said when I first ran, I ran, and I ran for Congress because I got pissed. I was. My colleagues and I were recruiting spies and stealing secrets and putting ourselves in harm's way. And in addition to doing all that, I had to brief members of Congress. And I was pretty shocked by the caliber of our elected leaders. And I thought they were doing things that were negating what my friends and I and colleagues were doing. And so my mama said, you're either part of the problem, part of the solution. And so I moved from Afghanistan back to my hometown of San Antonio and ran for Congress. Lost by 700 votes in a runoff, but glad I don't tell that story anymore. And so then I even said, these jobs have a shelf life, 6, 7, 8 years, right? And so for me, my district was 29 counties, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. It took 10 and a half hours to drive across it at 80 miles an hour, which was the speed limit in most of the district. I found out the hard way, it's not the speed limit in all of the district. And it was larger than 28 states, 26, 28 states, roughly the size of Georgia. And so for me, the things that I loved talking about technology in a policy setting. And now for me to be able to be in a technology setting talking about policy and how do we ensure? The only way we're going to ensure that additional 245 years of American global leadership and things like advanced technology is if the public sector and the private sector start working together. I've seen that issue on the public sector side, and to be able to do that on the private sector side is pretty good. And so that's why I decided to walk away. A lot of people want me to criticize the organization. Look, there's some frustrations in it. It was designed to be inefficient. That's that's a design in this to make sure one person can't just cram a bunch of stuff in. And I'm proud. I think 21 pieces of legislation signed into law in 6 years, more than most people do in 2 or 3 decades. That's not a joke. That's actually like legitimate. And so that's why I decided.
And is the sophistication of your former colleagues on those intelligence issues that so drove you crazy when you were briefing them, has that improved?
No comment, no. Look, there are some members that, had I met when I was in the CIA, y'all would not know my name because I'd still be in the CIA. Because I'd be like, I'm glad that person is making that law. But I saw just as many people as I saw when I was in the CIA that I was frustrated with.
Okay. Over here? Yeah.
Thank you. You touched briefly about some of the social issues that we face. Given the debate in Congress now about the definition of infrastructure, could you give us your take on what it should be and how it should be handled?
Sure. This is a extension of the earlier problem I talked about, the concentration of power in a handful of few that are making the decisions. Because if you let the committees do their work and you vote on individual pieces of legislation, then you would start seeing more things coming out of Congress. And so this infrastructure is bridges, roads, locks, dams, digital infrastructure as well too. We've learned that in COVID. There was I think it was FCC did a study. They thought that only 33 million Americans didn't have access to high-speed internet. When Microsoft did a report and looked at people actually using services, it was closer to like 133 million, right? A third of Americans not having access to high-speed internet. That digital divide is only going to grow. So I think digital is clearly in the infrastructure piece. And if you want to talk about healthcare issues, we should be increasing access to and decreasing costs of healthcare. We should be figuring out how it's easier for families to take care of their kids. We should be able to have that debate. But when you try to throw everything into the kitchen sink, you're never going to be able to get an ability to get things done in a bipartisan way. Oh, and by the way, the only way we've gotten big things done is if we do them together. Right? Every piece of legislation, you think, hey, that was a good piece of legislation, it was done in a bipartisan way. It started about 20 years ago thinking that unified government, where you have the House, the Senate, and the White House is all one party, is the only way to govern. No, it's a terrible way to govern, because guess what's going to happen? In 2 years, those things are going to be fought and try to turn away. Republicans are going to take back the House in 2022, period, full stop. And this is, we got to make sure that we're working on issues where people agree on. And I think there's a lot of agreement, even though it doesn't feel that way.
Let's see, there was a hand up over here before, yeah, right there.
I'm curious if you could articulate your innermost feelings and fears on January 6th when the events that took place. Were you there? Could you hear things going on the outside? How aware were you of the activity outside your where you all were stationed?
So I wasn't there. My last official day was January 4th. The real last day was, I think, December 20th, when we passed a budget. And so my time was up. I was actually supposed to fly to D.C. on January 6th. And my assistant texted me like, hey, are you watching TV? And she texted, and it was shot. So there's and we haven't talked about Afghanistan. But my CIA career started the day of the USS Cole bombing. USS Cole, Navy destroyer, attacked by Al-Qaeda in the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Yemen. And I was in the agency when 9/11 happened. I was the 4th employee in Counterterrorism Center Special Operations Division, which prosecuted the war in Afghanistan. And we all remember, that image of that second plane flying into the second tower. To me, there's this image in the House floor of 2 plainclothes police officers pulling their weapon, and a member of Congress they broke off a leg of a chair. And you saw these people banging on the door. To me, right, that image, if the image of the second plane flying into the World Trade Center was an indication of Islamic extremism, that picture is to me, kind of the existential crisis we're dealing with now of disinformation, misinformation, and outright lies, right? A different kind of extremism here. And so I get pissed, pardon my language. I think about, so this is day 2 of I don't know how many new members of Congress were there on January 6th. Not only was it new members of Congress, it was a new staff. So imagine a 23-year-old, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, excited, I'm here to help my hometown congressman, and you're like, this is like, we're in an ambush, this is an insurrection, this is crazy. Like to me, that is we put so many young men and women who get crap pay, right, that do so much for our country, and for those members of Congress that want to act like that was a normal day is insane, right? It's insane, and it was an insurrection. It was encouraged, and those flames were fanned by President Trump, and we also should be looking at why was that the people that were in there to do our business, why were they not better protected? So those are my opinions there.
Well, I'd love to take more questions. Unfortunately, we are not out of questions, but we are out of time. But it's been great being back here with you, Will, and reminds me of how much I miss having you in Congress, where we could spar back and forth on this. But fortunately, we're able to in your new world as well. And I thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to be here.